Welcome to the world of Dr. Hell, where peaceful nights turn into haunting moments and dreams become unforgettable nightmares. Close your eyes, relax, and let the darkness tell you its tales. But remember, fear never sleeps. This happened in the 1990s. Specifically, it was 1994 when my life took an unexpected turn into darkness. There's a peculiar kind of silence you only find deep in the woods, the kind that makes you question whether you've ever truly heard quiet before. My name is Logan Mitchell, and back in 1994 I was stationed as a park ranger in the vast stretches of the Allegheny National Forest in Pennsylvania. I'd always found solace among the trees, perhaps because they don't judge you for being a man of few words. After a decade in the Marines, I thought trading deserts and mountains for forests would be a peaceful shift. I believed being a park ranger would be like early retirement, a chance to swap my rifle for a radio and my helmet for a wide-brimmed hat. Most days, that's exactly what it was. I'd patrol the trails, guide the occasional lost hiker back to the path, and spend my evenings reading by the campfire. I even had a running joke with my colleague Vera that the most dangerous thing in these woods was the coffee in the station's break room. We'd laugh about it, but little did we know how wrong we were. The Allegheny National Forest sprawled over 500,000 acres, a sea of green punctuated by pristine lakes and winding rivers. It was a place where time seemed to move differently, where the modern world felt distant and insignificant. The towering hemlocks and maples stood as silent sentinels, their branches reaching towards the sky like gnarled fingers. My daily routine was simple but satisfying. I'd wake up before dawn, brew a pot of that infamous station coffee, and head out just as the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the canopy. The early morning mist would cling to the forest floor, giving everything an ethereal quality. It was during these quiet moments that I felt most at peace, most connected to the world around me. But there was always an undercurrent of something else, a feeling I couldn't quite shake. Maybe it was my military training, or maybe it was something more primal. But I always felt like I was being watched, not by anything human, mind you, but by the forest itself. It was as if the trees had eyes, silently observing our comings and goings with ancient, inscrutable wisdom. I remember one particular morning in early autumn. The leaves had just started to turn, splashing the canopy with vibrant reds and golds. I was making my usual rounds when I came across a family of deer. They were so still, so perfectly framed by the misty forest backdrop, that for a moment I thought I was looking at a photograph. Then, in an instant, they were gone, bounding off into the underbrush with barely a sound. It was moments like these that made me appreciate the raw beauty of nature, its ability to inspire awe and wonder. But they also served as a reminder of how small and insignificant we humans truly are in the grand scheme of things. The forest had been here long before us, and it would likely outlast us all. As the days grew shorter and the nights cooler, there was a palpable shift in the atmosphere of the forest. The wildlife became more active, preparing for the harsh winter ahead. Bears gorged themselves on berries, squirrels frantically gathered acorns, and flocks of birds passed overhead on their long journey south. It was during this time of transition that I first began to notice something off. It was subtle at first, easy to dismiss as imagination or coincidence. But as the weeks wore on, it became harder to ignore. The first sign was the silence. Now, forests are never truly silent. There's always the rustle of leaves, the chirping of birds, the scurrying of small animals. But there were moments when all of that would suddenly stop, as if someone had flipped a switch. It was an unnatural quiet that set my teeth on edge and made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Then there were the tracks. As part of my job, I was used to identifying animal prints, deer, bear, coyote, you name it. But occasionally I'd come across tracks that didn't quite fit. They were too large for a bear, too elongated for a wolf, and they always seemed to appear and disappear at random, as if whatever made them could simply vanish into thin air. I mentioned these oddities to Vera one evening as we were closing up the station. She laughed it off, suggesting that maybe I'd been spending too much time alone in the woods. "You're starting to go native on me, Logan," she joked. "Next thing you know, you'll be telling me you've seen Bigfoot." I forced a laugh, but her words didn't sit well with me. I knew what I had seen, what I had felt. Something was out there, something that didn't belong. And deep down, I had a sinking feeling that sooner or later I was going to come face to face with it. As I drove home that night, the forest seemed to press in around me, the trees looming over the narrow road like silent spectators. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was following me, just out of sight in the darkness beyond my headlights. I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself that it was just my imagination running wild. After all, I was a trained professional, a former Marine. I'd faced real dangers, real enemies. What could possibly be lurking in these familiar woods that I couldn't handle? But as I pulled into my driveway and killed the engine, I couldn't help but glance back at the tree line. For a split second, I thought I saw something. A flicker of movement, a pair of eyes reflecting the moonlight. Then it was gone, leaving me to wonder if it had ever been there at all. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the wind whisper through the trees outside my window, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The forest I thought I knew so well suddenly felt alien and threatening, and somewhere out there in the darkness, something was waiting, watching, biding its time. Little did I know this was just the beginning. The true horrors that awaited me in the depths of the Allegheny National Forest were beyond anything I could have imagined, and they were about to change my life forever. As October rolled in, bringing with it a chill in the air and a carpet of fallen leaves, the sense of unease that had been growing within me reached a fever pitch. The forest, once a source of comfort and solace, now seemed to harbor secrets in its shadowy depths. Every creaking branch, every rustle in the underbrush, set my nerves on edge. It was on a particularly gloomy afternoon that I received the call that would set in motion a chain of events I still struggle to comprehend. Vera's voice crackled over the radio, tinged with an urgency that immediately put me on high alert. "Logan, we've got reports of illegal hunting activity up in the northern quadrant. You know the area. The locals call it the Deep Green. I need you to check it out." The Deep Green. Even the name sent a shiver down my spine. It was a part of the forest that few ventured into, a place where the trees grew so thick that sunlight barely penetrated the canopy. It was easy to get lost there, to become disoriented in the endless sea of green. "Copy that," I responded, trying to keep the apprehension out of my voice. "I'm on my way. Any details on what I'm walking into?" There was a pause, a moment of static that seemed to stretch on for eternity. When Vera's voice came back, it was softer, almost hesitant. "Just be careful, Logan. There's something not right about those reports. Hikers claiming they heard strange noises, saw things they can't explain. Probably just their imaginations running wild, but..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. I knew exactly what she meant. The strange tracks, the unnatural silences, it all came flooding back. "I'll keep my eyes open," I assured her. "And Vera? If you don't hear from me in 3 hours, send backup." As I gathered my gear, my hand hesitated over the equipment locker. Regulations allowed us to carry firearms when investigating potential poaching, but I'd always preferred to rely on my wits and experience. This time, though, something compelled me to reach for the old Winchester rifle. Its weight was reassuring in my hands, a tangible link to my military past. The drive to the northern quadrant was tense, the forest pressing in on either side of the narrow dirt road. As I ventured deeper into the park, the trees seemed to grow taller, their branches intertwining overhead to form a natural tunnel. The afternoon light filtered through in dappled patterns, creating an ever-shifting landscape of light and shadow. I parked the Jeep at the trailhead and stepped out, immediately enveloped by the hushed atmosphere of the Deep Green. The air was thick and heavy, carrying the musty scent of decaying leaves and damp earth. I shouldered my pack, checked the radio one last time, and set off into the wilderness. The trail quickly became overgrown, forcing me to push through dense underbrush. Every step was an effort, the forest seeming to resist my intrusion. I found myself constantly checking over my shoulder, unable to shake the feeling that I was being followed. As I ventured deeper into the heart of the Deep Green, I began to notice subtle changes in my surroundings. The vegetation took on strange, twisted forms, as if shaped by some unseen force. Moss-covered rocks bore odd spiral patterns that I couldn't recall ever seeing before. And the silence, that unnatural, all-encompassing silence, pressed in from all sides. It was then that I first heard it. A low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was unlike anything I'd ever encountered in my years as a ranger. Not the call of any animal native to these woods, nor any natural phenomenon I could explain. It resonated deep in my chest, setting my teeth on edge and sending a cold sweat trickling down my spine. I gripped the rifle tighter, my knuckles turning white. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to flee this place and never return. But duty, and a morbid curiosity I couldn't quite suppress, drove me forward. As I crested a small rise, I came upon a sight that stopped me dead in my tracks. Before me lay a small clearing, bathed in an eerie, greenish light that seemed to emanate from the very air itself. And at the center of this clearing stood a structure that had no right to exist in these woods. It was a stone monolith, easily 20 feet tall and covered in strange, swirling symbols that hurt my eyes to look at directly. The air around it shimmered and distorted, as if the very fabric of reality was being warped by its presence. I approached cautiously, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. This was no work of modern man. The weathered surface of the stone and the complexity of the symbols spoke of something far older, far more alien. As I drew closer, the rumbling sound intensified, vibrating through the ground beneath my feet. The symbols on the monolith began to glow with an inner light, pulsing in a hypnotic rhythm that threatened to draw me in. I don't know how long I stood there, transfixed by the impossible sight before me. It could have been minutes or hours, but suddenly a twig snapped behind me, breaking the spell. I whirled around, rifle at the ready, to find myself face to face with a nightmare made flesh. The creature that emerged from the shadows defied description. It stood easily 8 feet tall, its body a writhing mass of tentacles and chitinous plates. Multiple eyes, glowing with an otherworldly intelligence, fixed upon me with predatory intent. In that moment, I understood with terrifying clarity that I was no longer the apex predator in these woods. I was prey. The next few seconds were a blur of adrenaline and instinct. I fired the rifle, the report deafening in the unnatural silence of the clearing. The creature recoiled, ichor spraying from a wound in what I could only assume was its torso. But it didn't fall. Instead, it let out a piercing shriek that threatened to split my skull. I ran. I ran like I'd never run before, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for direction or stealth. Behind me, I could hear the creature giving chase, its inhuman cries echoing through the trees. Branches whipped at my face. Roots threatened to trip me at every step, but I pressed on. My lungs burned, my legs screamed in protest, but the sheer terror coursing through my veins kept me moving. I don't know how long I ran or how far. The forest blurred around me, becoming a green labyrinth with no end in sight. Just when I thought my legs would give out, I burst through a line of trees and found myself on the edge of a ravine. There was no time to stop, no time to think. I could hear the creature crashing through the underbrush behind me. With a desperate cry, I leapt across the chasm, my fingers scrabbling for purchase on the far side. For one heart-stopping moment, I thought I wouldn't make it. But then my hands found a root, and I hauled myself up onto solid ground. I looked back just in time to see the creature emerge from the tree line. Our eyes met across the ravine, and in that moment, I saw something that chilled me to my very core. It wasn't just hunger or predatory instinct in those alien eyes. There was intelligence there, and malevolence. This wasn't just some animal. It was something else entirely. Something that didn't belong in our world. The creature paced at the edge of the ravine, clearly unwilling or unable to make the jump. Its tentacles writhed in frustration, and it let out another of those bone-chilling cries. Then, to my utter disbelief, it spoke. The words, if you could call them that, were unlike anything I'd ever heard. They seemed to bypass my ears entirely, resonating directly in my mind. I couldn't understand them, but their meaning was clear. This wasn't over. As suddenly as it had appeared, the creature turned and vanished back into the forest. I slumped to the ground, my body shaking uncontrollably, as the adrenaline began to wear off. I wanted nothing more than to curl up and wait for this nightmare to end. But I knew I couldn't stay here. I had to warn someone, had to tell them what I'd seen. With trembling hands, I pulled out my radio. "Vera," I gasped. "Vera, come in. This is Logan. I've seen something impossible. Send help. Send everyone." Only static answered me. I was on my own. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, I steeled myself for the long trek back. Every sound, every movement in the gathering darkness set my nerves on edge. I knew that somewhere out there, the creature was waiting, watching, and I couldn't shake the feeling that our paths would cross again. The deep green had revealed its secrets to me, and nothing would ever be the same again. The journey back to civilization was a blur of exhaustion and paranoia. Every shadow seemed to hide a lurking threat. Every rustle in the underbrush sent my heart racing. By the time I stumbled out of the tree line and into the parking lot where I'd left my Jeep, the first rays of dawn were just beginning to peek over the horizon. I collapsed into the driver's seat, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. As I sped down the winding forest road, I kept expecting to see that monstrous form appear in my rearview mirror, but there was nothing. Just the endless sea of trees, their branches reaching out like grasping fingers in the early morning light. When I finally pulled up to the ranger station, Vera was waiting for me. The look of relief on her face quickly turned to concern as she took in my disheveled appearance. "Logan, what happened out there? We've been trying to reach you all night." I opened my mouth to explain, but the words wouldn't come. How could I possibly describe what I'd seen? The monolith, the creature, the impossible reality of it all. It sounded insane even in my own mind. Vera led me inside, sat me down, and pressed a mug of steaming coffee into my trembling hands. "Start from the beginning," she said softly. "Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together." So I told her everything. The strange tracks I'd been seeing for weeks, the unnatural silences in the forest, and finally the horrors I'd encountered in the deep green. As I spoke, I could see the disbelief in her eyes slowly give way to a growing unease. When I finished, there was a long moment of silence. Vera took a deep breath, her brow furrowed in thought. "Logan," she said carefully, "I believe that you believe what you saw, but you have to understand how this sounds. A giant monster? A glowing monolith? It's impossible," I finished for her. "I know. But Vera, I swear to you, it's all true. Every word of it." Vera leaned back in her chair, her eyes searching my face. I could see the conflict in her expression, the desire to believe her colleague and friend warring with the sheer implausibility of my story. "Okay," she said finally. "Let's say, for argument's sake, that everything you've told me is exactly what happened. What do we do now? We can't exactly file a report about what did you call it? An otherworldly creature?" She had a point. The bureaucracy of the Park Service wasn't exactly equipped to handle encounters with interdimensional beings. But we couldn't just ignore this either. Whatever I had seen out there in the deep green, it was a threat to every person who set foot in these woods. "We need to go back," I said, surprising myself with the conviction in my voice. "We need evidence. Photographs, samples, anything that can prove what's out there." Vera's eyes widened. "Go back? Logan, you can't be serious. After what you've been through." "Exactly because of what I've been through," I cut her off. "Vera, that thing is still out there, and if we don't do something about it, more people are going to get hurt, or worse." She held my gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, but we do this by the book. We file a report about suspected illegal activity in the area. That'll give us cause to mount a proper expedition. And we're not going alone. I'm calling in every available ranger and local law enforcement officer we can get." I nodded, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. Part of me had hoped she would refuse, would tell me I was crazy and order me to take some time off. But I knew she was right. We had to face this head on. The next few days were a flurry of activity. Reports were filed, equipment was gathered, and a team was assembled. We told them we were investigating reports of a large predator, possibly a bear, that had been aggressive towards hikers. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was enough to justify the scale of our operation. As we made our final preparations, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were woefully unprepared for what awaited us in the deep green. The rifles and tranquilizer guns we carried seemed pitifully inadequate against the memory of that tentacled monstrosity. The night before we were set to depart, I found myself standing on the porch of my cabin, staring out into the darkness of the forest. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves whispering secrets I couldn't quite make out. Somewhere out there, beyond the reach of my sight, I knew the creature was waiting, watching, perhaps even planning. As I turned to go back inside, a flicker of movement caught my eye. For a split second, I could have sworn I saw a pair of glowing eyes watching me from the tree line. But when I looked again, there was nothing there but shadows and leaves. Sleep eluded me that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that otherworldly monolith, its symbols pulsing with an unholy light. I heard the creature's voice in my head, speaking words that defied human understanding. And underneath it all, that constant rumbling drone that seemed to emanate from the very earth itself. As the first light of dawn broke over the forest, I rose from my restless bed, more exhausted than when I'd laid down. But there was no turning back now. Whatever horrors awaited us in the deep green, I knew we had to face them. The alternative, leaving that thing out there to prey on unsuspecting hikers and campers, was unthinkable. I met Vera and the rest of the team at the ranger station. The mood was tense, the air thick with unspoken apprehension. Even those who hadn't been told the full story seemed to sense that this was no ordinary expedition. As we loaded our gear into the vehicles, I caught Vera's eye. She gave me a small nod, a silent affirmation of our shared purpose. Whatever happened out there, we were in this together. The convoy set out just as the sun was beginning to peek over the treetops. As we drove deeper into the forest, following the winding road towards the northern quadrant, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were heading into the belly of the beast. The trees seemed to press in closer, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out more and more of the sky. By the time we reached the trailhead that led into the deep green, the forest had taken on an almost primordial quality. The air was thick and heavy, filled with the musty scent of decay and something else, something alien and indescribable. As we unloaded our gear and prepared to set out on foot, I saw several members of the team exchange uneasy glances. They could feel it too, the wrongness that permeated this place, the sense that we were trespassers in a realm that didn't belong to us. I took a deep breath, shouldered my pack, and took the first step onto the overgrown trail. Behind me, I heard the others fall into line, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of fallen leaves. We were entering the deep green once more, and this time I knew there would be no running away. Whatever awaited us in the heart of this ancient forest, we would face it together. For better or for worse, we were about to uncover the truth behind the mysteries that had plagued these woods. As we pushed deeper into the forest, the sense of otherworldly menace grew stronger with each step. Little did we know, the true horrors of the deep green were only just beginning to reveal themselves. The deeper we ventured into the deep green, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The canopy overhead grew so thick that it blotted out the sky, plunging us into a perpetual twilight. The air grew heavy and stagnant, thick with the scent of decay and something else, a cloying alien odor that made my stomach churn. Our team moved in silence, the only sounds the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional snap of a twig. Every so often, someone would startle at a shadow or a sudden movement in the corner of their eye. The forest seemed to be playing tricks on us, distorting our perceptions and fraying our nerves. I led the way, my eyes constantly scanning the surrounding trees for any sign of the creature I'd encountered. But there was nothing. No tracks, no claw marks, no evidence at all of the nightmare I'd witnessed just days before. Part of me began to wonder if I had imagined it all, if the stress and isolation had finally gotten to me. But then I would catch a glimpse of something, a twisted tree that seemed to writhe when viewed from the corner of my eye, or a patch of moss arranged in impossible geometric patterns, and I would be reminded that this place didn't follow the rules of the world we knew. We had been hiking for several hours when Vera called for a break. As the team settled down to rest and check their equipment, I pulled her aside. "Something's not right," I muttered, keeping my voice low to avoid alarming the others. "We should have reached the clearing with the monolith by now. It's like the forest has shifted somehow." Vera frowned, her eyes scanning the surrounding trees. "You're sure we're on the right path?" I nodded emphatically. "Positive. I may have been running for my life, but I know these woods. We should be there by now." She was silent for a moment, considering. Then she said, "Maybe we should split up, cover more ground." The word sent a chill down my spine. "No," I said, perhaps too forcefully. "We need to stick together. Whatever's out here, it's not something any of us should face alone." Vera looked like she wanted to argue, but something in my expression must have convinced her. She nodded, then turned to address the team. "All right, people, 10 more minutes, then we move out. Stay alert and remember, we're here to observe and document, no heroics." As we prepared to set out again, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest seemed to press in around us, the trees looming overhead like silent sentinels. And always, there was that low, rumbling drone, barely audible but constant vibrating through the ground beneath our feet. We had been walking for perhaps another hour when one of the younger rangers, a guy named Mike, suddenly stopped in his tracks. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice tight with fear. We all fell silent, straining our ears. At first I heard nothing but the usual forest sounds, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a bird. But then, faintly, I caught it. A sound like nothing I'd ever heard before. It was a kind of chittering, but with an almost mechanical quality to it, as if someone had recorded the sound of 1,000 insects and played it back through a broken speaker. And it was getting closer. "Weapons ready," Vera barked, her training kicking in. The team formed a defensive circle, rifles and tranquilizer guns at the ready. I found myself back to back with Vera, my heart pounding in my chest. The chittering grew louder, seeming to come from all around us. The underbrush rustled and swayed as if something, or many somethings, were moving through it just out of sight. And then, without warning, they were upon us. They burst from the undergrowth in a writhing mass of tentacles and chitin. Each was about the size of a large dog, but there the resemblance to any earthly creature ended. Their bodies were a nightmarish fusion of insect and cephalopod, with multiple eyes that glowed with an eerie phosphorescent light. The air was filled with the sound of gunfire and screams. I saw Mike go down, disappearing under a wave of the creatures. Vera was shouting orders, trying to maintain some semblance of control, but it was chaos. I fired my rifle again and again, each shot finding its mark, but for every creature that fell, 2 more seemed to take its place. Their ichor sprayed across my face, burning like acid where it touched my skin. In the midst of the fray, I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood run cold. Towering over the smaller creatures was a familiar form, the massive, tentacled monstrosity I had encountered on my first ill-fated expedition into the deep green. Its eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment I knew with absolute certainty that it recognized me. A tendril of thought, alien and invasive, slithered into my mind. "You should not have come back." The words paralyzed me, my rifle slipping from suddenly numb fingers. I was dimly aware of Vera shouting my name, of the smaller creatures closing in around me, but all I could focus on were those eyes, ancient and unknowable, boring into my very soul. Just as the creatures were about to overwhelm me, a deafening explosion rocked the forest. A blinding flash of light seared my vision, and I felt myself being thrown backward. When my senses cleared, I found myself lying on my back, staring up at a sky I shouldn't have been able to see through the dense canopy. A massive hole had been torn in the forest roof, sunlight streaming down into the unnatural twilight of the deep green. I struggled to my feet, my ears ringing and my body aching. Around me, the remnants of our team were regrouping, looking as shell-shocked as I felt. Of the creatures, there was no sign. They had vanished as quickly as they had appeared. Vera staggered over to me, her face pale and drawn. "Logan," she gasped. "What the hell were those things?" I shook my head, still trying to process what had just happened. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I think they were just the beginning." As if in response to my words, a low, ominous rumble echoed through the forest. The ground beneath our feet began to tremble, and in the distance I saw trees toppling as if pushed aside by some massive, unseen force. Whatever had been awakened in the deep green, it was coming for us. And I had a sinking feeling that our weapons, our technology, our very understanding of the world, none of it would be enough to save us from what was coming. As we stood there, battered and bewildered in the heart of a forest that no longer made sense, I realized that we had crossed a threshold. We had glimpsed a reality beyond our comprehension, and there was no going back. The only way out was through, into the heart of the mystery that had consumed the deep green. With a sense of grim determination, I picked up my rifle and turned to face the oncoming storm. Whatever horrors awaited us, we would face them together. The truth of the deep green was about to be revealed, and the world would never be the same again. The forest trembled around us, the very air seeming to vibrate with an otherworldly energy. In the distance, we could hear the sound of splintering wood and tearing earth, growing louder with each passing moment. Whatever was coming, it was massive beyond imagining. "We need to move," Vera shouted over the cacophony. "Now!" There was no time for discussion, no opportunity to form a plan. We ran, our path chosen more by instinct than any real sense of direction. The forest blurred around us, trees and undergrowth melding into a nightmarish landscape of twisted shapes and impossible angles. Behind us, the sounds of destruction grew ever closer. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. The forest was unraveling. There was no other word for it. Trees, rocks, even the very ground itself seemed to be coming apart at the seams, revealing glimpses of something beyond, a void filled with writhing shapes and colors that hurt the eyes to look upon. And emerging from this chaos was a form so vast, so utterly alien, that my mind recoiled from the sight of it. It was as if a mountain had come to life, but a mountain shaped by the fevered imagination of a mad god. Tentacles the size of redwoods whipped through the air, tearing apart everything in their path. Eyes larger than lakes blinked open across its impossible surface, each one filled with an intelligence and malevolence that froze the blood in my veins. "Don't look back," Vera's voice cut through my horrified trance. "Just run." We crashed through the underbrush, our lungs burning and our legs screaming in protest. The remaining members of our team had scattered, their panicked cries echoing through the disintegrating forest. I wanted to stop, to try and help them, but there was no time. The very fabric of reality was coming apart around us, and our only hope was to somehow stay ahead of the destruction. Just when I thought my legs would give out, when the roaring chaos behind us seemed mere seconds from engulfing us, we burst through a line of trees and found ourselves in a familiar clearing. The stone monolith stood before us, its symbols pulsing with an intense, otherworldly light. "The monolith," I gasped, my voice hoarse. "It's some kind of anchor point, a gateway." Vera looked at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. "A gateway to where?" Before I could answer, a deafening roar shook the clearing. The tree line behind us exploded outward as the colossal entity pushed through, its form seeming to shift and change with each movement, defying the laws of physics and sanity alike. In that moment, staring into the face of something so utterly beyond our comprehension, I made a decision that would change everything. "Through the monolith," I shouted, grabbing Vera's arm. "It's our only chance." She hesitated for just a second, then nodded. Together, we sprinted towards the glowing stone structure. Behind us, I could hear the entity's approach, feel the ground shaking with each impossible step. As we reached the monolith, the symbols carved into its surface began to move, swirling and shifting like living things. The air around us crackled with energy, and I felt a pulling sensation, as if every atom of my being was being drawn towards the stone. "Whatever happens," I said, looking into Vera's eyes, "we face it together." She nodded, a grim smile on her face. Together. Hand in hand, we stepped forward into the light. There was a moment of blinding, searing pain, as if every cell in my body was being torn apart and reassembled. I heard Vera scream, felt her hand slip from mine, and then silence. Absolute, perfect silence. I opened my eyes, not realizing I had closed them, and found myself elsewhere. Gone was the forest, the clearing, the monstrous entity that had pursued us. Instead, I stood on what appeared to be an endless plain, stretching out in all directions as far as the eye could see. The ground beneath my feet was a shifting mosaic of geometric patterns, pulsing with the same otherworldly light I had seen in the monolith symbols. The sky, if it could be called that, was a swirling vortex of colors I had no names for, constantly shifting and changing in patterns that made my head spin if I looked at them for too long. "Vera?" I called out, my voice sounding strange and muffled in this alien atmosphere. There was no response. I spun around, desperately searching for any sign of my partner, but I was alone on this impossible plane. The realization hit me like a physical blow. In our escape from one nightmare, we had been separated and thrust into another. As the initial shock began to wear off, I forced myself to think rationally. I was alive, which was more than I had expected when we fled through the monolith. And if I had made it here, wherever here was, then there was a chance Vera had too. I just had to find her. I picked a direction at random and began to walk. The landscape seemed to shift and change with each step, making it impossible to gauge distance or maintain any sense of direction. Time, too, seemed to have lost all meaning. I couldn't tell if I had been walking for minutes or hours. As I trudged on, I began to notice strange formations rising from the geometric ground. They looked almost like buildings, but their architecture was like nothing I had ever seen on Earth. Towers spiraled impossibly upward, their forms twisting and branching in ways that defied physics. Arches and walkways connected structures that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions at once. And then I saw them, the inhabitants of this alien realm. They moved through and around the impossible structures, their forms as varied and mind-bending as their surroundings. Some floated on currents of energy, while others phase-shifted between different states of matter. A few even seemed to exist as pure thought, visible only as ripples in the fabric of this strange reality. I ducked behind one of the twisted structures, my heart pounding. These beings, whatever they were so far beyond human comprehension that I couldn't even begin to guess at their nature or intentions. Were they hostile? Indifferent? Would they even perceive me as a living, conscious entity? As I peered out from my hiding place, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, a familiar sound cut through the alien cacophony around me. It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. Vera's voice calling my name. Without thinking, I broke cover and ran towards the sound, heedless of the bizarre entities that turned to watch my passage. "Vera!" I shouted. "I'm here! Where are you?" I rounded a corner formed by two intersecting non-Euclidean structures and skidded to a halt. There, standing in what appeared to be a plaza of sorts, was Vera. But she wasn't alone. Surrounding her was a group of beings that, despite their alien nature, I recognized immediately. They were the same species as the monstrous entity that had pursued us through the forest. But here in their own realm, they appeared different. Their forms were more stable, less chaotic, and their eyes, still impossibly large and numerous, held an intelligence that seemed almost curious. Vera turned at the sound of my approach, her face lighting up with relief. "Logan, thank God, I thought I'd lost you." I moved to join her, but stopped short when I saw the alien beings react to my presence. They didn't seem hostile, but there was a palpable tension in the air. "It's okay," Vera said, both to me and to the creatures around her. "He's with me. We came through together." One of the beings moved forward, its form rippling and shifting as it approached. When it spoke, the words bypassed my ears entirely, resonating directly in my mind. "You are the ones who fled the awakening," it said, its mental voice carrying a mix of curiosity and what I could only interpret as concern. "You have traversed the barrier between realms, a feat no human has achieved in millennia." I struggled to find my voice, my mind reeling from the sheer impossibility of the situation. What are you? What is this place?" The being's form shimmered, and I got the distinct impression it was considering how best to explain concepts far beyond human understanding. "We are the Guardians," it said finally. "This realm, which you perceive in a form your mind can comprehend, is the space between spaces. We maintain the boundaries between realities, ensuring the cosmic balance is preserved." "The creature in the forest," I said, the pieces starting to fall into place. "The one that was chasing us. It was one of you?" The being's form darkened, a wave of what I could only interpret as sorrow passing through it. "A fallen guardian, corrupted by prolonged exposure to your realm. It sought to tear down the barriers, to merge our worlds in a cataclysm that would have destroyed both." Vera stepped forward, her scientific curiosity overcoming her fear. "But why our world? Why the Allegheny Forest?" "Your forest sits upon a nexus point," another of the Guardians explained. "A place where the barriers between realms are naturally thin. We placed the monolith there eons ago, to serve as both a warning and a last resort should the worst come to pass." I thought back to the strange occurrences in the forest, the unnatural silences, the impossible tracks. "You've been trying to contain the fallen guardian," I realized. "That's what we've been sensing all this time." The first guardian nodded, or at least made a gesture I interpreted as agreement. "We have done what we can from our side, but the corruption had progressed too far. When you activated the monolith, it created a surge of energy that allowed us to finally banish the fallen one back to this realm." "So it's over?" Vera asked, hope evident in her voice. "The threat to our world is gone?" The Guardians exchanged what I can only describe as a look, despite their alien features. "The immediate danger has passed," one of them said, "but the barrier between our realms has been weakened. It will take time to heal." "And that's where we come in, isn't it?" I said, suddenly understanding why they hadn't simply sent us back or obliterated us on the spot. You need us to help maintain the boundary from our side. The lead guardian's form pulsed with approval. You understand correctly. We cannot directly interact with your realm without risking further damage to the cosmic fabric. But you, who have seen both sides, can act as our agents. You can protect the nexus point, ensure that no others stumble upon the monolith, and inadvertently weaken the barrier further. Vera and I looked at each other, the weight of this responsibility settling over us. We had entered the forest as simple park rangers, and now we were being asked to become guardians of reality itself. What about the others? Vera asked. Our team, the people who must have seen what happened. How do we explain all this? Time moves differently between our realms, one of the guardians explained. When you return, you will find that only moments have passed. As for explanations, the being's form shimmered with what I could have sworn was amusement. I believe your people have a concept called plausible deniability. Use it. I took a deep breath, trying to process everything we had learned, everything we had experienced. Part of me wanted to stay here, to learn more about this impossible realm and the beings that inhabited it. But I knew we had a duty to return, to protect our world from threats it couldn't even begin to comprehend. We'll do it, I said, looking to Vera for confirmation. She nodded, her expression a mix of determination and wonder. Very well, the lead guardian said. Its form began to glow, the light spreading to encompass Vera and me. We will send you back now, to the moment you entered the monolith. Remember, you are no longer simply rangers of the forest. You are now rangers of reality itself. As the light grew brighter, enveloping us completely, I felt a sense of profound change settling over me. We were returning to a world that looked the same, but nothing would ever truly be as it was before. We had seen beyond the veil, and that knowledge would shape everything we did from this moment forward. The last thing I heard before the light consumed us entirely was the Guardian's voice, echoing in my mind. Guard the boundaries well, rangers of reality. We will be watching. Vera and I found ourselves back in the clearing, standing before the now dormant monolith. Around us, the forest was quiet, showing no signs of the cataclysmic events we had just experienced. Our team was scattered nearby, looking dazed and confused, but otherwise unharmed. We shared a look, silently agreeing to keep the full truth of what had happened to ourselves. To the others, we spoke of gas leaks, hallucinations, and a series of small earthquakes that had thankfully caused no lasting damage. It wasn't the whole truth, but as the Guardians had suggested, it was plausible enough to be believed. In the months that followed, Vera and I threw ourselves into our new roles with a dedication that bordered on obsession. We patrolled the deep green relentlessly, using our newfound sensitivity to the barriers between realms to identify and reinforce weak points. We redirected hiking trails, created new protected habitats to keep people away from sensitive areas, and worked tirelessly to ensure that the secrets of the forest remained hidden. There were close calls, of course. Hikers who strayed too far off the path and glimpsed things they shouldn't have. Amateur paranormal investigators drawn by rumors of strange occurrences in the woods. Each time we were there to intervene, to misdirect, to protect both the unsuspecting humans and the cosmic balance we now served. And sometimes in the deepest parts of the night, when the barrier between worlds grew thin, we would stand before the monolith and feel the weight of our responsibility. In those moments, we could almost hear the voices of the Guardians reminding us of the vital role we played in maintaining the delicate fabric of reality. The Allegheny National Forest would never be the same to us. Where once we had seen only trees and wildlife, we now perceived the ebb and flow of cosmic energies, the whispers of other realms brushing against our own. It was a beautiful and terrifying responsibility, one that would define the rest of our lives. As I stand here now, years later, looking out over the forest that has become so much more than just a wilderness, I can't help but reflect on the journey that brought us to this point. We entered the deep green as park rangers and emerged as something far more, guardians of a truth too vast and strange for most to comprehend. The forest keeps its secrets, and we keep ours. And in the quiet moments when the wind whispers through the trees and the boundaries between worlds grow thin, I listen for the echoes of that other realm and remember the incredible responsibility we bear. For we are no longer simply Logan and Vera, park rangers of the Allegheny National Forest. We are the rangers of reality, the last line of defense between our world and the unimaginable wonders and horrors that lie beyond. and as long as we draw breath, we will stand guard, protecting the delicate balance that keeps our reality safe from the chaos that lurks just beyond the veil. The deep green may look like any other forest to the casual observer, but for those who know where to look, who have glimpsed the truth behind the veil of reality, it will forever remain a place of mystery, danger, and cosmic significance. A reminder that there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy, and that sometimes the greatest adventures and the greatest responsibilities can begin with a simple walk in the woods. My name is Michael Donovan, but the story I'm about to tell you happened back in 2002 when I was just 30. It's a tale that's haunted me for years, one that changed the way I look at the wilderness and the shadows that lurk within it. I've always been what you might call a nature enthusiast. The great outdoors was my sanctuary, a place where I could escape the hustle and bustle of city life and find some peace. Weekends would often find me hiking trails or camping in state parks, seeking that quiet solitude that only nature can provide. I never quite fit into the typical 9-to-5 grind, so these escapes were my lifeline, keeping me sane in a world that often felt too loud and too fast. I was a bit of a loner, which suited me just fine. Don't get me wrong, I had friends, but they were few and carefully chosen. Quality over quantity, as they say. My idea of a good time wasn't hitting the bars or attending big parties. It was a weekend in the mountains, away from the chaos of civilization. That year, I had planned a solo hike in the Blue Ridge Mountains, a stretch I hadn't yet explored. I'd heard whispers about the beauty of Evergreen Ridge, and it seemed like the perfect spot to unwind and reconnect with nature. I meticulously packed my gear, double-checking everything from my first aid kit to my water purification tablets. Early one Saturday morning in late September, I loaded up my old Jeep Cherokee and hit the road, the excitement of adventure coursing through my veins. As I drove, I remember joking to myself about finding Bigfoot or stumbling upon some hidden Appalachian mystery. Little did I know, I'd soon be wishing it was just a mythical creature I'd encounter. The weather was perfect when I arrived at the trailhead, clear blue skies with just a hint of autumn crispness in the air. I shouldered my pack, took a deep breath of the pine-scented air, and set off down the trail. The first few miles were a hiker's dream. The path wound through dense forests of oak and hickory, their leaves just beginning to turn gold and red. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, creating a dappled pattern on the forest floor. About 10 miles in, I found a spot that seemed tailor-made for camping. It was a small clearing nestled between two ridges, with a babbling brook nearby and a perfect view of the surrounding hills. I pitched my tent, gathered some firewood, and settled in for the evening. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. It was one of those rare moments where everything just felt right with the world. That first night passed uneventfully. I woke at dawn, the cool mountain air nipping at my nose as I crawled out of my tent. I brewed some coffee on my camp stove, its rich aroma mingling with the earthy scent of the forest. After a quick breakfast of granola and dried fruit, I set out to explore the area. I had a topographic map with me and had spotted a promising peak about 3 miles from my campsite. The trail was challenging but rewarding, winding up steep inclines and along narrow ridges. I reached the summit around noon, and the view took my breath away. Rolling mountains stretched as far as the eye could see, a sea of green dotted with splashes of autumn color. I spent a good hour up there, munching on my packed lunch and snapping photos with my old film camera. It was on the way back to camp that I first noticed something odd. There were boot prints on the trail that hadn't been there earlier. They looked fresh, the edges still crisp in the soft earth. I felt a small knot form in my stomach. I hadn't seen another soul all day, and this stretch of the mountains wasn't exactly a popular hiking spot. Still, I told myself, other people have every right to be out here enjoying nature. I shrugged it off and continued back to my camp. By the time I returned, the sun was beginning to dip low in the sky. I gathered more firewood and set about preparing my dinner, a simple meal of dehydrated chili that I rehydrated over my camp stove. As I sat by my small fire, enjoying the warmth of the chili and the cool evening air, I heard a rustling in the bushes nearby. At first, I didn't think much of it. Probably a deer or maybe a raccoon, I thought. But then I heard it again, closer this time. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it towards the sound. The beam cut through the gathering darkness, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me. After dinner, I sat by the fire reading a book I'd brought along, a well-worn copy of Jack London's Call of the Wild. The irony of my choice of reading material wouldn't occur to me until much later. As I read, the sounds of the forest at night surrounded me. The hoot of an owl, the chirp of crickets, the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. But then I heard that sound again, the one that didn't quite fit. This time it came from a different direction. I stood up, my heart beginning to race. I scanned the darkness with my flashlight, its beam seeming feeble against the vast blackness of the forest. Again, I saw nothing out of the ordinary, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Deciding that my imagination was getting the better of me, I turned in early, making sure my tent was securely zipped and my gear was stowed safely. Sleep didn't come easily. I lay in my sleeping bag, every snapping twig or rustling leaf jolting me awake. It was in the deepest part of the night when I heard it, a sort of muffled crunching noise, unmistakably close. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay there listening intently. It was just outside my tent. With trembling hands, I slowly unzipped the tent flap, peeking out with my flashlight. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting an eerie, flickering light over the campsite. In that dim light, I saw a figure crouched by my food stash. "Hey," I shouted, more out of instinct than bravery. The figure stood up abruptly, and I could see it was a man. He was tall and lean, wearing a dark jacket and a cap pulled low over his face. He didn't say a word, just stared at me for a moment that felt like an eternity. Then, without warning, he bolted into the woods. I scrambled out of my tent, grabbing my hunting knife as I went. My heart was racing, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I checked my food stash and saw that some of it was missing. The guy had been rummaging through my stuff. Anger and fear churned in my gut. Who was he? What did he want? I stayed up the rest of the night, my knife clutched tightly in my hand, listening for any sign of the man's return. But the forest had fallen silent, save for the usual night sounds. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, I made a decision. This trip was over. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting the stranger to emerge from the trees at any moment. The peaceful solitude I had been seeking was shattered, replaced by a gnawing anxiety that seemed to seep into my bones. I started hiking back towards the trailhead, my senses on high alert. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of fear through me. About halfway back, I came across another set of boot prints, fresh ones, leading off the main trail. Against my better judgment, curiosity got the better of me. Maybe I could find out who this guy was and why he was out here. I followed the prints, moving as quietly as I could. They led me deeper into the woods, away from the marked trails. After about an hour of careful tracking, I saw something through the trees that made me stop in my tracks. There, in a small clearing, stood an old, dilapidated cabin. It looked abandoned at first glance, but then I noticed a thin wisp of smoke rising from a makeshift chimney. I approached slowly, my heart pounding so loud I was sure it would give me away. As I got closer, I could hear voices inside. It wasn't just one person. There were at least two, maybe three distinct voices. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was hushed, urgent. I crouched behind a large oak tree, trying to decide what to do next. Should I try to get closer? Should I go back and report this to the authorities? While I was weighing my options, I heard something that made my blood run cold. The sound of a car engine in the distance, coming from the direction of the trailhead. Panic set in. I had to get out of there, and fast. As I turned to leave, my foot came down on a dry twig. The snap seemed to echo through the forest like a gunshot. The cabin door flew open, and the man from the previous night stepped out, followed by two others. They scanned the forest, their eyes searching for the source of the noise. I held my breath, pressing myself against the tree, praying they wouldn't see me. After what felt like hours but was probably only a few seconds, they went back inside. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran. I ran like I've never run before, crashing through underbrush, leaping over fallen logs, my lungs burning and my legs aching. I didn't stop until I reached the trailhead, my car a welcome sight in the small parking area. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door unlocked. Once inside, I locked the doors and started the engine, peeling out of the parking lot in a spray of gravel. I drove straight to the nearest town, my mind racing as fast as my car. What had I stumbled upon? Who were those men? What were they doing out there in that isolated cabin? I pulled into the parking lot of the local sheriff's office, took a few deep breaths to calm myself, and went inside. The deputy on duty listened carefully as I recounted my story, taking notes and asking a few questions. He seemed concerned, but not overly surprised. "We'll check it out," he said, closing his notebook. "You did the right thing coming to us. We've had reports of some strange goings-on up in those mountains, but nothing concrete until now." I thanked him and left, feeling a mix of relief and lingering fear. As I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something far more dangerous than I realized. In the weeks that followed, I found myself jumping at shadows, constantly looking over my shoulder. The mountains, which had once been my sanctuary, now felt like a place of hidden dangers. I stopped going on solo hikes, and when I did venture out, it was always with a group and never too far from civilization. I never heard back from the sheriff's office about what, if anything, they found up there. But I did hear rumors. Stories about missing hikers, about strange lights seen in the mountains at night, about people who went into those woods and came back, changed. I don't know how much of it was true, how much was exaggeration, and how much was pure fabrication. But I knew what I had seen, what I had experienced, and it was enough to keep me away. Years passed and life went on. I got married, had kids, moved to a different state. But I never forgot about that weekend in the Blue Ridge Mountains. It would come back to me in dreams sometimes. The crunch of footsteps outside my tent, the silhouette of that cabin in the woods, the fear of discovery as I hid behind that old oak tree. One day, about 5 years after my experience, I was visiting an old college buddy in Asheville. We were sitting on his porch enjoying a couple of beers and swapping stories, when the conversation turned to hiking. Without really meaning to, I found myself recounting my experience in Evergreen Ridge. My friend, Jake, listened intently, his brow furrowing as I spoke. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You know, there have been reports of some sketchy activity up in those parts for years. Illegal stuff. Drug operations, poaching, who knows what else. Sounds like you might have stumbled onto something you weren't supposed to see." I felt a chill run down my spine despite the warm evening. "Great," I laughed, though it wasn't really funny. Just my luck. We talked a bit more about it, and I felt a strange mix of vindication and renewed unease. On one hand, it was comforting to know that I hadn't just imagined the whole thing, that there was potentially a rational explanation for what I had encountered. But on the other hand, it opened up a whole new set of questions. What exactly had I stumbled upon? How dangerous were those men really? And why had they let me go? I guess some questions never get answered. Life goes on, and you learn to live with the uncertainty. But even now, all these years later, when I'm out in nature, whether it's a family camping trip or just a walk in the local park, I find myself more aware of my surroundings. I notice things I might not have before. A snapped twig, a rustling in the bushes, the feeling of being watched. My experience changed me, made me more cautious, more aware of the potential dangers that can lurk even in the most beautiful places. It reminded me that even in our modern world, there are still wild places where the old rules don't apply, where the line between civilization and wilderness blurs. So if you're ever hiking in the Blue Ridge Mountains, or any remote area for that matter, and you see boot prints that don't belong, or hear rustling in the bushes at night, be careful. You never know what or who you might find out there. And if you're like me, you'll make sure to stick to the well-traveled paths and keep your wits about you. Because in the end, it's not always the bears or the wolves you have to worry about in the wilderness. Sometimes the most dangerous creatures in the forest walk on two legs, and they're the ones that leave no trace, save for the stories told around campfires and the lingering fear in the hearts of those who've encountered them. As for me, I still love nature, but now I prefer to enjoy it from a safer distance. Maybe someday I'll go back to those mountains, face my fears, and lay those old ghosts to rest. But if I do, you can bet I won't be alone, and I'll definitely be better prepared, because some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some shadows are better left unexplored.